Resistance. In an era of ever-increasing injustice and tyranny, it's on everyone's mind. How does one resist oppression when the military-industrial complex shows that it has no qualms about ending lives and movements? While the cards are stacked against us, the people are and have been resisting oppression for thousands of years. Today I'll be diving into the earliest story of resistance, as well as times everyday people rose up against the most powerful governments and militaries. From the US Civil Rights Movement to the origins of Palestinian resistance in Lebanon, as well as South Africa's triumph over apartheid. So sit back, tune in, and welcome to episode 2, History of Resistance. And the charity for this video is Team Congo. You can check them out. I'll put a link in the bio. They deliver essential aid and education to the lovely people of Congo. For every view up to 500, I will be donating $1 to this lovely charity that's doing amazing work. So the first ever documented strike occurs in ancient Egypt around 1152 to 1170 BCE. During the 29th year of Pharaoh Ramses III's reign. Artisans who were building the royal necropolis at Deir al-Medina in present-day Tebes, Egypt, stopped working due to unpaid rations and wages, marking the first ever documented act of organized labor disobedience. Like them men abandoned their work on the tombs of the Valley of the Kings, marched out of the village, and occupied the surrounding temples. Not only was the strike successful in getting them their rations, it also sparked a lot of other strikes in the following years, which is a theme you'll see throughout this video. Now, these strikes can all be found recorded in the Turin Strike Papyrus. And Ma'at was an ancient goddess that represented balance and justice, and I think these strikes can be seen as a form of maintaining these things. Okay, let's fast forward like 3,000 years to the US Civil Rights Movement. Yes, I know I skipped a lot of resistance movements like the French Revolution or the Revolutionary War, but we were already taught all that. Rather than highlighting Rosa Parks though, who is a legend that we all know, I want to highlight the first instance that happened 9 months before with a young 15-year-old queen named Claudette Colvin. Trigger warning, you're going to hear some really petty shit from the government, but she was one of the plaintiffs in Browder versus Gale, which was the case that ended bus discrimination. Okay, so as I said, she was 15, a high school student, and she relied on buses. And how it worked back then was that if a bus was too full with all of the white seats, black folks would have to move further back to give white people the nearest seats, or they'd have to stand in the aisles if no seats were available. So one day, this happened. All the white seats were full, so Claudette and a pregnant lady, Ruth Hamilton, were asked to move further back. Claudette and Ruth, they said, nah, we good here. And eventually the driver was a bitch-ass snitch, so police got called and Claudette was forcibly removed, yelling that her constitutional rights were being violated. Now, this happened 9 months before Rosa Parks, but it goes back to the point, right, that this type of resistance spreads. You see one person doing it, another more public-pleasing resistance will appear. Like Claudette's mother essentially said that Rosa Parks was a better representation for this type of resistance because she was fair-skinned and not a pregnant, unwed teenager. Regardless, though, Claudette was convicted of this BS, but the charges were dropped and she eventually took this to court, which led to the declaration that all segregation on public transportation was unconstitutional. But how do you create resistance if you are in exile and not allowed to return home? After the 1948 Arab-Israeli War, approximately 100,000 Palestinian refugees fled to Lebanon, while others fled to areas like Jordan. After Palestinian groups like Fatah had their fighters expelled from Jordan in 1970 in an event called Black September, they moved their headquarters to Beirut. And prior to this, for the first 2 decades, The community was largely marginalized and monitored by Lebanese intelligence called the Dokhmeh Beru. And resistance was largely clandestine at first until the 1967 Six-Day War, which radicalized the refugee population and catalyzed the rise of armed fedayeen, which are essentially guerrillas. Under the Cairo Agreement in 1969, the Palestinian Liberation Organization, or PLO, was legalized and given autonomy over these refugee camps, as well as the ability to launch attacks into Israel from southern Lebanon. For about a decade, the PLO basically ran southern Lebanon and parts of Beirut. This is where the movement became, in a sense, cinematic. They had their own hospitals, schools, and a massive media machine.
You know how strong the Israelis are.
إسرائيل وأمريكا وكل دول العالم ما بتأثر علينا طول ما سلاحنا بإيدنا ولا أي دولة في العالم تقدر تحاربنا.
That means we are not ready to surrender.
طول ما هو الشعب رافع راسه والشعب معنا ما حدا بيقدرنا.
طلع شاب young.
However, after Israel's 1982 invasion of Lebanon, the nature of resistance in Lebanon shifted. While the PLO lost its formal military base, several factions remained. Today, Palestinian resistance in Lebanon is largely political, or it works in coordination with Hezbollah under the axis of resistance framework, and they focus on intelligence and shared logistics rather than independent cross-border type of raids. And the final act of resistance that I would like to highlight is very dear to me, not only because I was born in South Africa, but also because I feel like it offers a very clear and usable roadmap that can be applied to modern day society. And this is the struggle against apartheid in South Africa. If you don't know, apartheid was basically legal segregation that began in 1949 with the prohibition of mixed race marriages and relationships. Not only did it affect who you could love, it also affected where you can go. It affected where you can attend school and what hospitals you can go to. Like, for example, from the 60s to the 80s, over 3 million Black South Africans were displaced from their homes and placed into specific areas known as Bantustans. But I am not here to talk about what apartheid was. I'm here to talk about how they resisted this oppression and eventually ended this corrupt and racist system. They didn't just protest, they didn't just beg their politicians. They had many ways of resistance. In 1949, the African National Congress, or ANC, which was eventually replaced by the more radical ANCYL, it's basically ANC with the youth, it was led by Walter Sisulu, Oliver Tambo, and future President Nelson Mandela, who advocated a radical Black nationalist program that combined Africanist ideas of Anton Lembede with Marxism. They proposed that white authority can only be overthrown through mass campaigns. While the ANCYL took control of the ANC, the organization advocated a policy of open defiance and resistance for the first time, which unleashed the 1950s Program of Action, instituted in 1949, that emphasized the right of African people to freedom under the flag of African nationalism. It laid out plans for strikes, boycotts, and civil disobedience, resulting in mass protests, stayaways, boycotts, strikes, and occasional violent clashes. And there was Black and brown unity in this, with the South African Indian Congress and the Colored People's Congress joining in. They had a program of action and defiance campaign, with one of the goals being to overwhelm the government. Like, one of the first acts of defiance in this campaign was a march of 50 people in Joburg after their 11 p.m. curfew that was instituted. And it went according to plan, as they were apprehended, but it did spark the rest of the country to follow its example. The country was galvanized, and everybody was with the shits. It started
disregarding racial laws by doing things like walking through white-only areas. And after 5 months, this was so effective that the political leadership had to call it off because of how many riots, strikes, and heavy sentences were occurring. As I said, this was effective. ANC membership grew from 7,000 to 100,000, and the number of subdivisions went from 14 at the beginning to 87 at the end. But did the government change its stance? Yes, but no. The apartheid laws were relaxed until the government did their usual Empire Strikes Back BS and cracked down harder. They passed an amendment that essentially made it illegal to incite or encourage protests. Now, there's too much to dive into for a short YouTube video, but I want to highlight 3 other areas of resistance in South Africa. The first is armed resistance, which was sparked by the Sharpeville massacre, where a crowd of 20,000 people marched on a police station, but unfortunately 69 were killed after officers decided to fire into the crowds. And most of these slain people were black. Though the officers said they panicked, many of these slain were shot in the back. And after they saw this and the success of other revolutions like in Cuba, Algeria, and Indochina, the leaders felt it was time for armed resistance. So though the ANC was banned at this time, they still proceeded with their actions, which involves what history says as bombing public facilities, police stations, and military bases. The men were willing to attack and murder their oppressor. Could this work today? Honestly, with the amount of money, weaponry, intelligence, and propaganda, I do not recommend this whatsoever. It could gain support, I don't know. But as we've seen, it doesn't have to be against a particularly government institution or military base. It can be against companies and CEOs. However, 2 other particularly crucial points of resistance were within the students and the unions. The Soweto uprising was sparked by a decree that forced black students to learn Afrikaans, which was the language of their oppressor. Many students decided, nah, we're not going to school, and they had mass rally in which over 175 people were killed. This sparked more student protests and organizations, and ultimately an alternative education system was developed. As I said, this goes back to the point, one act of resistance may spark multiple. And finally, the unions, which I feel were very crucial. Now, black people back then in South Africa were not allowed to have unions, and they were often abused and not given a living wage. So what did they do? They still did the strikes. The first was at Coronation Brick and Tile Company, where the men there went on strike for a pay raise from like 10 to 20 rands a week. But then more strikes for higher wages and improved conditions and ending exploitations occurred during this period. Other industrial and municipal workers were inspired by these men, and they also walked off their jobs. Like a month later, 30,000 black labor workers were on strike in Durban. This damaged their employers because they relied on this labor. And eventually in 1979, they were allowed to unionize. And in my opinion, they brought the economy to a halt. And this is something that is possible today with the strength of unions in our countries. My dad, he likes to tell this story that this was something that was so big and common and solidified that if you were caught working or shopping on these days, you would get your ass beat. Like, that's how much solidarity was expected in these times. And now this is what's possible. This is what's needed on a mass scale if we really want to garner proper change. Like, imagine if half of the country, right, just half, actually stopped working and shopping. Do you know how fast things would change? And the problem, in my opinion, isn't the game plan, right? It's actually the fact that we're too desperate to try it. But there is a turning point coming where people have lost their sense of desperation, where people have truly nothing left to lose, and where people have no other option but to defy and resist.